welcome back for this afternoon's session. The title of this session now is Tayeb Salih in the World. So we have two speakers who will somehow try to situate Tayeb Salih, his work, the reception of his work in a more, I'd say, global or globalized or post-globalized context. And our first speaker is someone very well known here in Oxford. He has often come to chastise our students as external examiner in Turkish. He is an author and translator, born in Kuwait, 1959. Timour Muhidine, I think I have not said his name, it's really bad of me. So Timour read English literature, English language and literature, as well as Turkish studies at Lille, Manchester and Paris universities. He lives in Paris and teaches Turkish literature as an associate professor of Turkish language and literature at INALCO in Paris. He's in charge of a series of contemporary Turkish authors at Akta Süd Publishing. Approximately 30 works have been published. 37, okay. As we speak. So his latest books are Constantinople occupée, 1918-1923, une histoire culturelle that he co-edited with Frédéric Kitson, came out last year, I believe. And Voyage en grand écran, that was also published last year. So very, very prolific author, Timour. But today he is going to look at the reception in French and Turkish of Tayeb Salih's Season of Migration to the North. So, thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Thank you for organizing this meeting, which seemed very attractive to me. Well, I must confess I can't read Arabic, but I've read translations of this novel. I say translation because I read it in English first. That's it. You know the book, and then in French, and then in Turkish. And that's what gave me the idea of trying to retrace the history and sort of reception story of an important, more than important novel. So Tayeb Salih's novel, Season of Migration to the North, as mentioned in the foreword of the Penguin edition, was largely translated in more than 20 languages, a rare event for a contemporary Arabic novel. So when you read that, personally, I'd like to know which language. And of course, this is never mentioned. So you have to get by with such information. In France and Turkey, the two countries we're going to talk about, the peculiar point is that the first translations were made by full-fledged authors and professional translators. It was not a haphazard translation. Maybe some of you know the Tunisian poet and novelist Abdelwahab Meddeb, who was working for Sinbad Publishing House, and in Turkey, the poet Özdemir İnce, great poet, that they were the first translators for this book. So the literary link, in my opinion, was preserved and open to quality versions that integrate better in the world of belles lettres, in the world of literature. It's always better to have a professional or writer translating it. So then, second translations have then appeared in both languages, French and Turkish, and the novel has joined the ranks of the great classics of the 20th century. So we can also witness an academic reception, this is the latest development, in France and Turkey that is gaining momentum, showing that the canonization of the text is underway. Now, if we come back to Tayeb Salih's stay in Britain, I'd like to come back to the BBC days, which are always mentioned in the different memoirs, probably in his memoirs, which I haven't read yet, but these are translated and I'll have a look. And so the British reception of Tayeb Salih was, in my opinion, influenced by the fact that his narrator and hero, the Sudanese writer, was a student and young journalist in England. There is a parallel in the novel and the author's life. And you can get, for those who are interested, you can get some more precise information in Dennis Johnson's Davis, which we mentioned this morning, memoirs, which I happened to find in Egypt a few years ago. And they are great, first, because he translated a lot and he was very dedicated to this modern Arabic literature. But there's a full chapter, chapter 12, on Tayeb Salih, and not only on Tayeb Salih, but on his relation with Tayeb Salih. Apparently, they had an important friendship, a little like what you mentioned this morning, and something that lasted many years, and especially Dennis Johnson Davis started translating Tayeb Salih before he was really famous. He got the short stories published in Beirut or other places, and then started translating them into English before attacking the novel, the first novel, that is Season of Migration to the North. About this translation, there's something maybe that should be mentioned. The first edition in 1969 was published, translation, I mean, by Heinemann in London in an Arab African series. Probably some of you remember that series, very attractive, in fact, because it makes two, I mean, from my point of view at the moment, when I found them, there was obviously a connection, but we didn't know there was a connection between these two eras and languages. And it was the first full translation, well, then in English. Later, it came into this very popular collection of Penguin Modern Classics. So the success of this novel, I'm not sure whether it was immediately successful. That is, the first edition was probably a little on the side. I mean, Heinemann collection was not so prestigious at the time. But when it came out in Penguin Classic, it really became very successful. And probably it can be attributed to the historical context of this publication. The end of British colonial rule in the Arab world, what we heard this morning, in Sudan it was 55, and then followed by other occurrences, fostered a broad movement of intellectual and cultural decolonization, again, that horrible word, aimed at re-examining the European legacy from the perspective of formerly colonized peoples. This marked, that was in the 70s, 80s, was earlier in England and America, and later in Western Europe, France in particular. This marked the beginning of what is called post-colonial studies. So Tayeb Salih's novel, it has been mentioned many times since the beginning of this meeting, seems to be part of a post-colonial movement. But after reading it closely, I'm sure himself wouldn't have accepted a simplistic denunciation of colonization in his novel. The colonial alienation he portrays through the protagonist is rooted in the ambiguity of the colonized person's dual cultural identity. What I would like to tell you, because this is something you probably don't know, is that this is not specific to this Sudanese author. We have quite a few authors in Turkey who at the same time, and even earlier, I think of Attila İlhan, Attila Ilan is a great novelist of the mid-50s to the late 60s. For instance, wrote a novel on Turks in Turkish students in Paris called Zenciler birbirine benzemez. Black people don't look like each other. I mean, they are all different, that's what it means, that's from the title, in 1953. And this is the same kind of novel, with the same kind of alienation, same kind of disillusion of the period. And Attila Ilan is not known outside Turkey. I don't think he was ever, this novel was never translated in any other language. But he had the same kind of, although most Turks would tell you, they were never colonized, but they were decolonized in a way, with the period. So this is interesting because there are different ways of getting to the same point, in fact, for writers in the period. It was part of the l'air du temps, the atmosphere of the period. Now I'll turn to the French reception, if you want. The novel, Salih's novel, was translated quite early in the resurgence movement of translations to French from Arabic. A movement which was monitored by the Sinbad publishing house. Maybe some of you know of it. It was really the first French publishing house which decided to publish regularly classics and modern novel. And the first modern novel chosen of all Arabic literature was Tayeb Salih's Saison de la Migration vers le Nord, in original language. So maybe I should tell you a few words about the literary venture Pierre Bernard, the founder of Sinbad, started in the 1970s, and which aimed at making Arab classics first visible in French for the first time. So I don't know exactly why Tayeb Salih's novel was chosen as the first, even before Najib Mahfouz. I mean, then they published a lot of Mahfouz novels, but he was the first one. Okay, so we can imagine, we can interpret that in different ways. First, it's a very good novel, I mean, I do admit that, but probably because it was not too long, probably it was very exotic for French readers. I mean, there are reasons like that, and that should be done by people who will work in the future on such receptions. And this first translation was published in 1972, just a few years after Johnson's Davis translation, and it was called Le Migrateur, the migrant, which is slightly different from the original title. And it was translated by a Lebanese journalist and translator, Fadi Noun. And Fadi Noun is still alive in Beirut, and writing a lot on political events. And to my knowledge, the only translation he did. So it was probably an order from Sinbad Publishing House. And to make it more impressive, Le Migrateur, the novel, there was a foreword by Jacques Berck. Now, maybe you know who Jacques Berck is or was a very famous Arab and Islam specialist in France, sociologist. So the academic legitimation was what was thought of by the publishing house, I think. At the time, he was professor at the Collège de France. So Jacques Berck was a big name, slightly far from what we could expect for such an author. You don't have to be a specialist in Islamic studies to introduce a modern Arabic novel. But that's what the case. And Jacques Berck was also very close to anti-imperialist thinkers in France. Maxime Robinson, for instance. He was also very involved in the Maspero publishing house, left-wing, anti-imperialist publishing house. Anyway, so this first translation, a little modified, with modified title, and the text also was sort of modified inside. What the critics call a watered down version of the Oriental imagination regarding the West. And the text translation almost systematically omitted the critics of Orientalism that punctuate the Arabic text. So it's a strange case, you see, and it didn't sell bad. In my remembrance, it was quite a good success for such an obscure book at the moment. But a few years later, exactly when was that? 86. So that's 14 years later, the second version appeared by Abdelwahab Medden, Tunisian intellectual, very famous in France. And he decided to translate the full title, so it became Saison de la migration vers le nord, season of migration to the north. And he restored the omitted passages because he had read it in Arabic and he said, okay, this book is a great book, you can't leave it like that. So I have to retranslate it. That's what he did. It was in the, how could I say, in the same movement, Edward Said's Orientalism was published, 78, then very quickly translated into French. So there was a sort of movement toward that kind of inspiration. Probably the most interesting point is that no Arabic novel, especially contemporary Arabic novel, was translated twice in such a short period. But first of all, they were mostly not translated, untranslated. But when they were never retranslated. So it's a special case. There's something about it. A lot of readers considered it a very, very important work, and probably more important than the realistic novels of Mahfouz or other Arab writers of the time. So Abdelwahab Medden, whom you may not know, was a contributor to many history and cultural magazines in the 70s. Then he started collaborating to publishing houses like Le Seuil for a long time, became a reader for Le Seuil in 73, and between 1974 and 1988, he was a literary advisor and series editor at Sinbad. So he helped introduce readers to classical authors of Arabic and Persian literature, as well as the great voices of Sufism. So maybe here we come to an important point. Abdelwahab Medden wrote many books on Sufism. His grandfather was a sheikh in Tunis. So there's a very important thing. He was also a contemporary writer himself. He has 2 novels in French, and he was able to spot the references to Sufism in Tayeb Salih's work. And he always insisted that he was committed to honoring what he called his dual heritage, important thing, European and Islamic, French and Arab. He didn't write a foreword to the translation, but he wrote a small text, which I tried to translate into English. It's very short. So the novel opens with this small text. My aim was to remain faithful to the flow and timing of the Arabic text, that is, to its rhythm and musicality. The novel has been given its literal title. So this is very clear, editorial work in the best sense. Then a few years later, it came out as a pocket book. Now you can buy that at every French bookshop. So, it's another indication of the importance, because an important book eventually becomes a paperback. Otherwise, it remains, on the shelves forgotten. So the reception was quite good, as we heard this morning. François Mauriac That's you who mentioned François Mauriac, the French writer. No, that was you. Sorry. Sorry, I forgotten. I had forgotten. But when François Mauriac, who is not a specialist or even a great fan of Arabic literature, says something, the end of the sentence was funny. Us who have read everything, that was very, it wasn't ironical. He was probably persuaded he had read everything. French intellectual, the best. So the reception was quite important in the mainstream press, but a few odd articles began to appear in academic journals. So it also tells something about the way this novel. I haven't got the figures. I mean, what I'd like in such cases, but it's very difficult to get the figures. How many books were sold? That's the only way to say it's a success or not. But you know how publishers are; they don't want to give their figures. Now let's turn to Turkey. So why talk about Turkish reception? Well, first because I teach Turkish literature. It's a field I know, but also because, in fact, this Turkish translation came through French, because Özdemir İnce is a poet reading and translating French, and it couldn't be otherwise in Turkey. Another debate we could have, but in Turkey, very few people, strange as it may be, can translate from Arabic, or they are Islamists. That is, they don't. Sorry, they don't translate modern literature. They may translate classics, they may translate well, philosophy books, whatever you like, but not that kind of. And that translation was published by Adam. You remember Adam Publishing House? Very interesting new rising star of the 90s in Turkey, republishing great classics from all over the world and introducing, sometimes, groundbreaking translations. By the way, the only Arabic title in the whole publishing house for 20 years. And it was called Göç Mevsimi, that is season of migration. So it's between the first French translation and the second one, you know, the two words, one word, two words, and eventually the whole sentence. That was in 1982. In 2011, it's quite a long time, we have a second translation by a translator called Adnan Cihangir at Ayrıntı Publishing House. And this is called Kuzeye Göç Mevsimi. Fine, this is the whole title. Eventually, we have the whole title. And the text is also much better because Özdemir İnce, the first translated from the first French version, the one that was faulty, and now we have the text translated from the original Arabic to well, something that. And again, I don't know the figures for this book, but you can find it everywhere. You find it really everywhere in Turkish bookshops. Still now, second edition, which means it has taken its place in the general landscape, you know, of what we call global literature. The preface, foreword given by Tayeb Salih in this edition, maybe you've read it. Has anybody read it? This introduction is very interesting because you have, because he talks a lot about figures and not getting the figures. I love this text because it's very rare that a writer, especially from a faraway country, dares talking about that. You know, I know I'm a good writer, but I'm not good enough to get the figures. So they cheat on me. And that's very important. I mean, it should be given in schools as an example of what's going on when you get translated most of the time, if it's not French or Italian or maybe German is a bit, I don't know, but you know, big languages and smaller languages. Yeah. ID is always foreigners. Yeah. And what is interesting, the Turkish translation, the second one, was included in a series of very important world literature authors. So again, the only Arabic author published with Julian Barnes, Peter Carey, Daniel Pennac from French, and etc. So this is like, for me, it's a miracle, you see. It's a miracle that it should have happened that way. So first remark before conclusion is that the problem for me is the translation from one Oriental language, Arabic, to Turkish. And this is never really discussed in Turkey because, well, you smile when I say probably it's an Islamist or that kind of debate. The thing is, the Turks cannot imagine the Arabs have a modern literature, whether in Sudan or other places. It's rather serious, in fact. Just would like to come back very quickly to the academic receptions. I've noticed that general recognition for Tayeb Salih has been taking place in most countries, especially on one book. But since 2010, many articles, a few PhDs, a lot of conferences were organized in Turkey on him, in a way more than in France, for instance. So it has taken, it has got an interest. Sometimes it is in connection with the post-colonial studies, but not only. In Kurdish, I think it's being translated, and the translator is also the translator of Frantz Fanon in Kurdish. You see how things go, and small corners that come back. So a lot of university works or researches are being carried on. Even new works, and that comes back to what we were talking about this morning, works on linguistics. Many talk about the quality of Tayeb Salih's Arabic and the different references, the proverbs, the expression, the whatever you like. So this is something new. It's more in-depth than it used to be. Another very short comment you could make is the covers, book covers. This one we have seen a lot. It's an interesting piece of art. In Turkish, it's a dessert. Arab world, seen through Turkish eyes. It's not very attractive like that. And for the French edition, it's poultry. Why not? Could be. It's not very inventive anyway, you see. But these covers could be. There are many translations. I've seen the Portuguese one with another poultry. I think maybe something could be written on that too. And I'm nearly done. Yeah. So this contribution was about what I like to call the second life of an Arab classic in foreign context. It tells us a lot about the status of Arabic literature in countries like France and Turkey. In France, we have a lot of translations from Arabic literature, but mostly classic, as I said. In Turkey, it's very limited, except that Özdemir İnce, same translator, translated Adonis from the French, and it was widely accepted as a good version, but nobody could judge, in fact, you see. So this is the limits of sometimes literary criticism. But what I noticed, and maybe say that as a conclusion, is that an important aspect of this translation is the renewed attention it has brought to Arabic literature from the peripheries of the Middle East. And I was thinking of Ibrahim al-Kuni, the Libyan writer, or authors from Yemen. They benefited, in fact, from the existence of Tayeb Salih, because some Arabic authors from the outskirts, as compared to Egypt or Syria, Lebanon, was recognized as an important author. And it also tells us that Arabic literature is not only written in Cairo or Beirut. By the way, it was probably written in London. I'm not quite sure. Okay, thank you.